Clara Thompson, an 85-year-old Marine Corps veteran, a woman of unyielding courage forged through 30 years of service, steps into Jack's Tavern every Wednesday. This weathered bar off Highway 9 is her sanctuary, a place of memories where she sips coffee and recalls better days. But one night, a scarred biker drunk on arrogance shatters the peace with a vicious punch, knocking Clara to the floor, blood streaming from her lip. The crowd freezes their silence, a cruel betrayal, as the biker gloats over his act. Yet 30 minutes later, Clara's son, a steely-eyed colonel, storms in with a military strike team, turning the tavern into a crucible of justice. What unfolds is a heart-pounding clash that challenges a town to rediscover its soul. Will Clara's resolve forge a new path, or will fear prevail? Join us for this gripping tale of bravery, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Clara's story will set your spirit ablaze. The air in Jack's Tavern pulsed, with the raw energy of a rock anthem, guitars wailing over the clink of glasses, and the low hum of conversation. It was a place where the scent of stale beer mingled with the grit of the open road, a roadside haven off Highway 9, where locals and drifters alike found temporary refuge. Into this rough-edged world stepped Clara Thompson, known to those who remembered her as Carrie, an 85-year-old Marine Corps veteran whose presence seemed to carry the weight of decades. Her faded veteran's cap, its embroidery worn but proud, sat slightly tilted on her silver hair, and her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room with quiet authority. She moved with a deliberate grace, her cane tapping softly against the weathered floorboards, a relic of battles fought long ago. Carrie had been coming here every Wednesday for years, not for the noise or the company, but for a single cup of black coffee that tethered her to a past when this place felt like home tonight. Though the tavern was about to become a stage for something far more visceral, a hulking biker, his face marred by a jagged scar that snaked across his cheek, sprawled at a table near the jukebox, his leather vest creaking as he leaned back. His buddies, equally rough, laughed too loudly, their voices cutting through the music. When his gaze landed on Carrie, something dark flickered in his eyes, a mix of disdain and amusement. He rose his boots, thudding against the floor, and bellowed, "Hey, old lady, get lost! This ain't your knitting circle!" The words were a challenge, a dare, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Carrie paused, her hand resting lightly on her cane, and met his stare. She said nothing, her silence a wall he couldn't breach. That defiance, that refusal to cower, seemed to ignite something in him. With a sneer, he lunged forward and threw a brutal punch, his fist connecting with Carrie's cheek. The crack of impact echoed like a gunshot. She stumbled, her cane clattering to the floor, and fell hard, a thin trickle of blood seeping from the corner of her mouth. Gasps rippled through the tavern, but no one moved. The bartender froze, rag in hand, his eyes darting away. Patrons shifted uncomfortably, their drinks suddenly fascinating. The biker's laughter filled the void, harsh and triumphant, as he towered over Carrie's crumpled form. But then something shifted. Carrie's hand steadied against the floor, and she lifted her head. Her eyes, cold and unyielding, locked onto his, cutting through his bravado like a blade. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of that gaze. In a voice low and steady, barely audible over the fading chords of the jukebox, she whispered, "You'll pay for that." The words weren't loud, but they carried a chilling certainty, a promise that hung in the air like smoke. The biker faltered, his smirk, wavering for a fraction of a second, as if he sensed something dangerous stirring beneath her frail exterior. Carrie's whisper wasn't just a threat. It was a spark igniting curiosity in everyone who heard it. What could an 85-year-old woman, bloodied and on the floor, possibly do to make good on such a vow? The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken questions. The crowd, still rooted in place, seemed to lean in, caught between guilt and anticipation. Carrie's face, bruised but resolute, held no trace of defeat. Her eyes burned with a fire that spoke of battles won and losses endured, a fire that hinted at a strength the biker had gravely underestimated. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would shake the very foundation of Jack's Tavern. That single moment that whispered promise set the stage for a reckoning. It wasn't just about the punch or the blood. It was about dignity, trampled about a hero disrespected in a place she once called her own. The injustice of it stung a raw wound that demanded justice. And as Carrie's words lingered, they planted a question in every mind: what would happen next? Who would answer her call? The answer was coming, and it would arrive with the force of a storm. Carrie's chilling vow, "You'll pay for that," echoes in the stunned silence, leaving everyone wondering how she'll turn the tables on her attacker. The hush in Jack's Tavern was a taut thread. Every creak of the floorboards sharp against the strained stillness that had settled. Clara Thompson stood at the heart of the turmoil, her cheek burning where the biker's fist had struck the pain, a faint shadow of trials she'd endured in distant wars. The sting was nothing compared to the bitter weight of the room's inaction. No one had moved. The crowd, a mix of grizzled locals and road-weary strangers, stood rooted, their eyes darting with unease, but their bodies betraying their cowardice. The biker, his scarred face curled into a smug grin, loomed over her, his bulk a dark silhouette against the tavern's dim glow. "Stay down, old lady," he snarled, his boot shoving her fallen cane with a mocking scrape that pierced the air. His cronies slouched at a nearby table, let out coarse laughs, their voices a cruel taunt. But Clara was forged in fire, her spirit untouched by their jeers. She'd faced worse than this thug's arrogance, and she wasn't about to yield. Clara drew a steady breath, her hand pressing against the dusty floor fingers, gripping the grit. She rose, first to her knees, then to her feet, her movements slow but resolute, like a fortress standing firm against a gale. The onlookers watched, some with faint sympathy, others with wary curiosity, as she straightened her slight frame, radiating an unshakable resolve. Her discarded cap lay forgotten, but she paid it no heed. Her eyes, fierce and unrelenting, locked onto the biker's, stripping away his bravado, with a gaze that felt like a physical force. His grin wavered, a shadow of doubt crossing his face, as her stare pinned him in place. "You think that's enough to break me?" She said, her voice low, each word a honed challenge that thickened the air. The biker's hand tightened around his beer bottle, his knuckles paling, and he shifted back a half step, an instinctive retreat he couldn't conceal. Her defiance was a spark in the tavern's gloom, a challenge that sent tremors through the crowd. Jenny, the young waitress lingering near the counter, clutched her tray, her breath catching as she watched. A flicker of courage stirred in her, but the biker's glare kept her silent, her hands trembling. Other patrons exchanged glances, their murmurs a faint hum of intrigue and guilt, some leaning forward, drawn to Clara's unyielding spirit. She didn't waver. With a calm, almost ritualistic motion, she reached into her coat pocket, her hand steady despite the ache in her bones. The biker tensed, his eyes narrowing, expecting a threat, but her fingers closed around an old cell phone, its edges worn smooth by years of use. Still holding his gaze, she dialed a number, her thumb moving with unwavering precision. "Mike," she said, when the call connected, her voice clear and commanding, slicing through the tavern's hush. "It's me. I've been attacked at Jack's Tavern." Come now, there was no quiver, no plea, just the steel of a woman who knew her strength. She snapped the phone shut and tucked it away, her eyes never leaving the biker's. "He's coming," she said, her tone a quiet vow that sent a chill through the room. The biker tried to muster a laugh, a forced bark that fell flat. "What, your nurse gonna roll you out?" he jeered, but his voice cracked, his confidence crumbling. His cronies joined in their chuckles, thin and uncertain. But Clara's silence was a louder rebuke. She stood like a beacon, her bruised face a testament to her endurance, her presence a condemnation of the room's spinelessness. Jenny's tray clattered softly, her eyes fixed on Clara with a mix of awe and regret. The crowd's murmurs swelled a current of anticipation, weaving through their stillness. Who was this Mike? The question pulsed in every mind, from the patrons wrestling with their inaction to the biker whose grip on his bottle was now a desperate anchor. Clara's call wasn't just a summons. It was a gauntlet, thrown a declaration that this fight was far from over. The tavern crackled with tension, the air alive with the promise of what was to come. Clara had turned the tide, and the man who'd struck her was about to face the consequences of his hubris. Her unbreakable resolve had lit a fire, and Jack's Tavern was moments away from its reckoning. The briefing room at Fort Griffin thrummed with purpose, its stark walls lined with maps under the glare of fluorescent lights. Colonel Michael Thompson, or Mike to those who knew him best, stood at the helm, his voice measured as he dissected a training drill for a room of junior officers. His camouflage fatigues were sharp, his gestures precise, every word carrying the weight of a man who'd earned his stripes through grit and instinct. The officers jotted notes, their focus tight, until a faint buzz sliced through the air. Mike's encrypted phone nestled in his vest vibrated, once, then again. His hand froze mid-sentence, a rare pause that drew eyes upward. He glanced at the screen, and the word "Mom" hit like a thunderclap. She never called during duty hours, not once in his decades of service. A chill settled in his gut. Without a word, he stepped away from the table, his boots echoing on the tiled floor, leaving the officers exchanging puzzled glances. He answered on the third ring, his voice taut but steady. "Mom, what's wrong?" Her words came like a blade. "It's me, I've been attacked. Come now." The stark urgency, cloaked in her unyielding calm, sent a surge of adrenaline through him. Attacked his mother, the woman who'd walked through fire and taught him to do the same. Now struck down his jaw, clenched his free hand, balling into a fist. The call ended abruptly, her voice still ringing in his ears. He didn't need details. Those 3 words were a battle cry. Mike stormed back into the room, his presence a gust of authority that silenced the murmurs. "Briefings done." He snapped his tone. "Cutting like steel, Captain Hayes. Get the rapid response team ready. We roll out in 5. The officers sprang into action, chairs scraping as they dispersed. But Mike was already striding down the corridor, his mind a razor's edge. A memory surged vivid and unbidden. He was 10, standing in a sun-baked backyard, a rifle heavy in his small hands. His mother's voice, steady and sure, guided him. "Mike, aim true, protect what's right, no matter the cost." She'd steadied his grip that day, her hands strong, her eyes fierce with a love that demanded courage. That lesson had carved itself into his core, guiding every mission, and now it roared back a summons he couldn't ignore. She'd been his first teacher, his anchor, and now she needed him. The thought of her facing harm alone kindled a quiet fury that sharpened his resolve. In the armory, the team moved like a well-oiled machine gear, clattering as they prepped. Mike briefed them in clipped tones, his voice a low growl. "We're mobilizing to protect a civilian under attack. Primary objective: secure the target. Neutralize any threat." The men nodded, their faces set, sensing the weight behind his words. They didn't ask who the civilian was. Mike's intensity told them it was personal. He checked his sidearm, its weight, a familiar comfort grounding him. The coordinates were locked, the vehicles primed, as he climbed into the lead SUV. Lieutenant Ruiz, his second-in-command, risked a question. "Everything okay, sir?" Mike's eyes, fixed on the horizon, narrowed. "It will be," he said, his voice a vow. The engines roared, and the convoy surged forward, tires biting the asphalt as they tore out of the base. The gates of Fort Griffin swung wide, and the vehicles sped into the gathering dusk, a line of dark steel slicing through the twilight. Mike's mind was a fortress, every thought honed to the task. His mother's call, brief and piercing, was all he needed. She'd taught him to act, to stand firm, and he wouldn't falter now. Each mile brought him closer to her, to the moment he'd face down whoever had dared to harm her. The convoy's rumble was a harbinger, a storm gaining strength, and the man who'd crossed his mother was about to learn the cost of his mistake. The air in Jack's tavern crackled with unease, the dim lights casting jagged shadows across the worn tables. Clara Thompson stood resolute, her bruised cheek a stark reminder of the biker's brutality, her unyielding gaze fixed on him. The crowd, a restless mix of locals and passers-by, hovered on the edge of action, their murmurs a low hum beneath the weight of the moment. The biker, his scarred face flushed with defiance, leaned forward, his bulk dominating the space between them. He slammed his beer bottle down, the sharp clink cutting through the room like a warning shot. "Who'd you call Grandma?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Some retired cop to hobble in and save you." His cronies, sprawled at their table, erupted in coarse laughter, their jeers fueling his bravado. But Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes, cold and piercing, held his, her silence a challenge that made his taunt falter. "You'll see," she said, her voice a low, deliberate blade, each word carved with chilling certainty. "He's coming, and you'll be begging for mercy." The words landed like a gauntlet, their weight silencing the biker's laughter. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease betraying his swagger, but he masked it with a scowl. The crowd stirred their whispers, swelling into a soft buzz of intrigue. Jenny, the young waitress clutching her tray near the counter, felt her heart pound. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, darted to Clara, a mix of admiration and guilt knotting her chest. She wanted to speak, to stand up, but fear chained her tongue, her fingers tightening until her knuckles whitened. The other patrons shifted, some exchanging uneasy glances, others staring at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. Her words had shifted the room's pulse, planting a seed of doubt in their minds, and a spark of dread in the biker's. The biker's face twisted, his bravado cracking under Clara's unwavering resolve. He lurched forward, slamming his fist on the table, the impact rattling glasses and sending a spoon skittering to the floor. "Shut your mouth!" he roared, his voice a raw edge of rage. "Or I'll hit you again, and this time you won't get up." The threat hung heavy, a dark promise that made the air feel thinner. Jenny gasped, her tray trembling, and a few patrons leaned back, their faces pale. But Clara stood her ground, her posture unyielding, her expression a mask of quiet defiance. She didn't respond, didn't need to. Her silence was a louder rebuke, a refusal to be cowed. The biker's chest heaved, his fists clenching as he fought to reclaim his dominance, but Clara's calm unnerved him, her certainty a mirror to his faltering nerve. The tavern felt like a powder keg, every breath a spark waiting to ignite. Jenny's eyes flicked to the door, her pulse racing as she wondered who Clara had summoned. The crowd's murmurs grew, a tide of anticipation laced with shame. A grizzled man at the bar gripped his glass, his knuckles tight as if wrestling with his own inaction. Another patron, a woman in a faded jacket, whispered to her companion, her voice barely audible. "She's not backing down." Clara's words. His coming echoed in their minds, a promise that stirred both hope and fear. Who was this man she spoke of with such conviction? The biker, sensing the shift in the room, grew restless, his eyes darting to his cronies, then back to Clara. His laughter was gone, replaced by a scowl that couldn't hide his unease. He'd expected her to crumble to beg, but her strength was a challenge he hadn't prepared for. The tension coiled tighter. The tavern a stage where every glance, every breath carried weight. Jenny's hands shook her tray, a fragile shield against the biker's rage. The crowd, caught between guilt and curiosity, leaned in their silence. A fragile thread stretched to breaking Clara's defiance had set the scene ablaze. Her words a beacon that promised retribution. The biker's threat lingered a dark cloud over the room, but Clara's calm was a counterpoint, a signal that the tide was turning. Someone was coming, someone who would answer her call, and the man who dared to strike her was moments away from facing the consequences of his actions. The tension in Jack's tavern hung like a storm, about to break the air thick with anticipation and dread. 30 minutes had crawled by since Clara's defiant stand, each second stretching the nerves of the crowd taut. The biker's threats still echoed his bravado, a fragile mask over growing unease, while Clara's unwavering presence held the room in thrall. Suddenly, a low, guttural roar shattered the stillness, the sound swelling from the highway beyond. Heads turned, eyes widening as the growl of engines grew louder, closer, a relentless force approaching. Dust swirled in the twilight outside, a hazy veil rising as a convoy of military vehicles screeched to a halt in front of the tavern, their tires kicking up clouds of grit that danced in the fading light. The ground seemed to tremble under their weight, a signal that the balance of power was about to shift. The tavern door swung open with a force that silenced the room. Colonel Michael Thompson stepped through, his military fatigues pressed to perfection, the Silver Eagle insignia on his chest glinting under the dim lights. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. Behind him, 6 Special Forces soldiers fanned out their civilian gear, doing little to hide their battlefield-honed bearing. Each moved with lethal grace, their presence a quiet command that filled the space. The crowd froze, their murmurs dying as the weight of authority settled over them. Jenny the waitress clutched her tray tighter, her breath catching at the sight of the disciplined unit. The biker caught mid-sneer, faltered, his face drained of color, a sickly pallor replacing his earlier swagger. His hand, still gripping his beer bottle, trembled, and with a soft clink, the bottle slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor in a spray of glass and foam. Mike's gaze swept the room, locking onto Clara. Her bruised cheek, stark against her pale skin, sent a surge of anger through him, but her steady nod reassured him she was unbroken. The biker's cronies, once loud with mockery, shrank back, their laughter replaced by uneasy silence. The tavern, moments ago, a stage for the biker's dominance, now felt small, its rough edges dwarfed by the military's arrival. Patrons shifted, some straightening as if instinctively acknowledging Mike's rank, others staring wide-eyed at the soldiers who stood like sentinels. The air was electric, every glance charged with the realization that Clara's promise. "He's coming" had been fulfilled in a way no one could have imagined. The biker's earlier taunts, his threats to strike again, now seemed hollow, a child's bluster against a gathering storm. The soldiers' presence was a silent declaration of intent, their disciplined calm more intimidating than any shouted order. Mike stood at the center, his authority radiating like heat, his every movement deliberate. The biker, his confidence shattered, tried to muster a glare, but his eyes betrayed him, darting nervously to the soldiers, then back to Mike. The glass shards at his feet glinted in the light, a symbol of his crumbling bravado. Jenny's hands shook her tray, tilting as she watched, torn between awe and fear. The crowd, once paralyzed by inaction, now leaned in their guilt, mingling with anticipation. A man at the bar, his face weathered by years, gripped his stool, his breath shallow as he sensed the reckoning at hand. Another patron, a woman with tired eyes, whispered to her neighbor, her voice barely audible. "That's her son." The words carried a mix of disbelief and respect, a recognition of the bond that had brought this force to their doorstep. The tavern was no longer just a bar. It was a battlefield, its rough-hewn walls bearing witness to a clash of wills. Clara's defiance had summoned this moment. Her call 30 minutes ago now answered with overwhelming force. The biker's reign of intimidation built on a single brutal act was unraveling before the eyes of a crowd that had failed to act. Mike's arrival, marked by the roar of engines and the dust of the highway, was a turning point, a promise that justice was no longer a distant hope. The man who dared to strike Clara was about to face a force he couldn't bully, and the tavern braced for what would come next. Colonel Michael Thompson's boots struck the tavern floor with deliberate force, each step a declaration of intent as he crossed the threshold of Jack's Tavern. The crowd, caught in a web of guilt and anticipation, parted slightly, their eyes fixed on the military unit that had transformed the room's dynamic. Clara Thompson stood unwavering, her bruised cheek, a silent testament to her ordeal. Her gaze steady as it met her son's. Mike's soldiers fanned out, their disciplined presence a quiet command that quelled the crowd's restless stir. Without a word, Mike turned to his mother, his voice low but resolute, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of pain beneath his steely resolve. Clara raised a steady hand, her finger pointing directly at the biker, her gesture a verdict delivered with unflinching certainty. The crowd's breath caught a collective pause as her accusation hung in the air. The biker, his scarred face twisting into a forced smirk, leaned back in his chair, clinging to his fading bravado. "Big deal, Colonel," he scoffed, his voice dripping with false bravado. She was asking for it, running her mouth. His words were a spark in dry tinder, drawing sharp gasps from the crowd. Jenny the waitress flinched her tray, trembling as she stared, appalled by his defiance. A few patrons shook their heads, their faces tightening with disgust, but none found the courage to speak. The biker's cronies, emboldened by his tone, let out a low snicker, but it withered under Mike's unyielding stare. The colonel's expression remained impassive, his calm a weapon honed for precision. He reached into his vest, his movements measured, and drew out a compact tablet, its screen glinting faintly in the tavern's low light. The biker's smirk faltered, a shadow of unease crossing his eyes as Mike's fingers tapped the device. With a single touch, the tablet cast a grainy security video onto a bare wall, its images stark and unforgiving. The footage showed the biker, his fist raised, striking Clara with vicious force. Her head snapped back, a thin trail of blood seeping down her chin as she fell. The crowd recoiled, a collective shudder rippling through them as the image froze. Clara's pain captured in brutal clarity. Jenny's breath hitched, her eyes welling as she turned away, unable to face the truth. The biker's cronies froze, their faces ashen, their earlier taunts now a bitter echo. The tavern, once a stage for their mockery, had become a place of judgment, the video an irrefutable truth. Mike's voice, cold and piercing, cut through the stunned quiet. Anything left to say? He asked, his words a quiet thunder that rooted the biker to his seat. The question was a blade slicing through any pretense the biker might have clung to. The biker's mouth worked silently, his defiance crumbling under the evidence's weight. His hands gripped the table, knuckles white, as he floundered for a response. But the video left no room for excuses. The crowd's eyes bore into him, their earlier silence now a source of shared shame. A weathered man at the bar clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around his glass. A woman nearby, her voice, a faint murmur, said, "That's undeniable." Her words carried a mix of awe and regret, a recognition that Clara's suffering demanded justice. Mike stood resolute, the tablet still in hand, his gaze unrelenting as the biker seemed to shrink. The soldiers behind him remained still, their presence a steady force amplifying the moment's gravity. The tavern had become a crucible, the video aflame that laid bare the bikers' cruelty and the crowd's complicity. Clara's endurance had brought them here, and Mike's resolve had exposed the truth. The biker's claim she deserved it was now a hollow taunt, drowned by the reality on the screen. Jenny's hands shook her tray, forgotten, as she grappled with her regret. The crowd, once passive, now felt the stirrings of accountability, their faces etched with anger and guilt. The biker was trapped, his arrogance reduced to ashes, and the tavern awaited the justice that would follow. The truth had been revealed, setting the stage for the reckoning to come. The weight of truth hung heavy in Jack's tavern. The security footage still seared into the minds of the onlookers. Colonel Michael Thompson stood resolute. His tablet now lowered, his piercing gaze fixed on the biker, whose bravado had crumbled under the undeniable evidence. The crowd, once a silent mass of inaction, stirred with a mix of shame and outrage, their faces reflecting the raw impact of Clara's suffering. The biker, his scarred features taut with desperation, gripped the table. His earlier defiance reduced to a flicker of panic. Mike's soldiers flanked him, their steady presence a quiet reminder of the authority that now governed the room. Clara, her posture unyielding, despite the bruise marring her cheek, watched in silence. Her strength a beacon that anchored the moment Mike stepped forward, his voice a controlled storm. Each word deliberate as he addressed the biker with a clarity that cut through the tavern's charged atmosphere. "You assaulted a hero," he declared, his tone sharp, unyielding. 30 years of service leading troops through the hell of Khe Sanh, saving 12 soldiers from certain death. And you think you can strike her and walk away? That's a felony, not a bar fight. The words landed like hammer blows, each one stripping away the biker's pretense. The crowd gasped, a few murmuring in awe at the revelation of Clara's past. A grizzled man at the bar, his eyes wide, whispered to his neighbor Khe Sanh. "She's the real deal." The bikers' cronies, once bold with their taunts, sat frozen, their faces ashen as the gravity of their leader's actions sank in. Mike's words didn't just condemn the biker, they painted Clara as a living legend, her sacrifice a stark contrast to the man's reckless cruelty. Mike turned his gaze, shifting to the tavern's manager, a wiry man who'd been hovering behind the counter, his hands fidgeting with a stack of napkins. The manager's eyes darted away, but Mike's voice pinned him in place. "And you," he said, his tone laced with disgust, "you told my mother to leave after she was attacked, instead of throwing out the man who hit her. That's not just cowardice, it's complicity." The accusation was a lash raw and unsparing, exposing the manager's failure as a betrayal of decency. The crowd's murmurs grew, a tide of disapproval rippling through them. The manager's face flushed his mouth, working soundlessly before he stammered, I'm sorry, I didn't know what to do." His voice cracked, the apology faltering under the weight of his shame. But it was a start, a crack in the wall of indifference that had shielded the biker's actions. The tavern felt transformed, its rough edges now a backdrop to a moral reckoning. Clara's quiet dignity, amplified by Mike's words, cast a light on the crowd's earlier silence, forcing them to confront their own inaction. A woman in a faded jacket, her hands clasped tightly, nodded slowly as if Mike's words had stirred something dormant within her. Another patron, a younger man with tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. The biker, cornered by the truth, seemed to shrink, his hands trembling as he realized the weight of his crime. Mike's soldiers remained vigilant, their presence a steady pressure that underscored the colonel's authority. The manager's apology, though feeble, was a spark, a sign that the tavern's complicity was beginning to fracture. Mike's condemnation was more than a rebuke. It was a call to accountability, a demand for justice that resonated beyond the biker and the manager. Clara's heroism, Her 30 years of service stood as a testament to the values the room had failed to uphold. The crowd, once passive, now felt the stirrings of responsibility, their faces etched with a mix of guilt and resolve. The bikers' cronies, their earlier bravado gone, exchanged nervous glances, sensing the tide turning against them. The tavern, once a stage for violence, was now a place of judgment, where truth had stripped away excuses. Mike's words had laid bare the injustice, and the man who'd struck Clara was now exposed, his fate sealed by the weight of his actions, and the stage was set for the law to take its course, and the tavern braced for the consequences that would follow. A sharp wail of sirens sliced through the charged stillness outside Jack's tavern, their piercing cry growing louder, closer, until red and blue lights flashed through the grimy windows, bathing the room in urgent pulses. The crowd, still reeling from the raw truth of the security footage, turned toward the door, their murmurs falling silent as the sound heralded a new force. The tavern's heavy door swung open, and 2 sheriff's deputies strode in their uniforms, sharp, their eyes, scanning the room with practiced authority. The lead deputy, a broad-shouldered man with a steely gaze, zeroed in on Colonel Michael Thompson, offering a curt nod before stepping forward. Mike, his posture unyielding, handed over the tablet, its screen frozen on the damning image of the bikers' assault. The deputy's face hardened as he viewed the footage his partner, a woman with a clipped demeanor, glancing over with a frown that deepened at the sight of Clara's fall. The biker, his scarred face pale with panic, lurched to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I didn't know she was some hero," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation, hands raised as if to push back the encroaching reality. "I didn't mean it." His plea was a frantic grasp at salvation, but it fell flat, drowned by the weight of his actions. Mike's voice cut through, sharp and unyielding, a blade of conviction. "You don't need to know who she is," he said, each word deliberate, resonating with finality. "Respect is the baseline, and you didn't even meet that." The crowd murmured, a ripple of agreement threading through their silence, their earlier inaction now a bitter weight. The deputies moved with swift precision, the lead officer drawing handcuffs with a metallic clink that echoed like a gavel. The biker's eyes widened, a flash of terror crossing his face as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the cold steel sealing his fate. "You're under arrest for assault." The lead deputy stated, his tone flat but resolute, leaving no room for argument. The biker's shoulders slumped, his head bowing, as if the cuffs carried the weight of his guilt. His gaze, wild with fear, darted around the room, finding no allies. His cronies, once bold with their jeers, sat frozen, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the floor. The deputies gripped his arms, guiding him toward the door, his boots dragging in a slow, defeated shuffle. The crowd watched their silence, a heavy shroud, their faces etched with a mix of relief and shame. A woman at a corner table, her fingers twisting a napkin, let out a quiet sigh as if the arrest had lifted a burden. A younger man nearby, his jaw tight, stared at his hands, grappling with the regret of his passivity. Clara, her expression serene yet firm, stood as a pillar of resilience, her presence a quiet force that anchored the moment. The deputies' radios crackled as they stepped into the night, the biker's figure swallowed by the flashing lights outside. The tavern seemed to exhale its rough walls, bearing witness to a shift from chaos to order. The crowd, once complicit in their silence, now faced the mirror of their inaction, their quiet, a testament to their self-reflection. Mike stood tall, his soldiers a steady backdrop, his gaze sweeping the room with a purpose yet to be fulfilled. The biker's arrest was a victory, a tangible step toward justice. But it was only the beginning. His removal had cleared the way for a deeper lesson, one that would challenge the tavern's soul and demand more than passive regret. The law had spoken, but the truth still called for reckoning, and Mike was ready to deliver it. The echo of the deputy's footsteps faded into the night, leaving Jack's Tavern steeped in a heavy quiet, the weight of justice served still settling over the room. Colonel Michael Thompson stood at the center, his soldiers a steadfast presence behind him, their disciplined calm, a stark contrast to the crowd's restless unease. Clara Thompson, her posture unwavering, bore the mark of her ordeal with a dignity that seemed to fill the space. The biker's absence left a void, but it was the crowd's earlier silence that lingered, a shadow of complicity they could no longer ignore. Mike's gaze swept over them, his eyes sharp with purpose, taking in the faces now etched with guilt and doubt. He stepped forward, his boots a steady rhythm on the worn floor, and when he spoke, his voice was a measured force, each word crafted to pierce the heart of their inaction. "My mother fell," he said, his tone low but resonant, carrying a weight that stilled the room. "Blood ran down her face, and not one of you said a word. Respect doesn't come from medals or titles. It comes from the courage to stand up when it matters." The words were a mirror, reflecting the crowd's failure back at them, unflinching and raw. A man in a weathered jacket, his hands clenched, let out a choked sob, tears spilling down his cheeks as Mike's truth struck home. His cry broke the silence, a crack in the tavern's fragile facade, and others shifted their faces, crumpling under the weight of their regret. Jenny, the young waitress, stood near the counter, her head bowed, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "I should have done something," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a confession to herself as much as to the room. Her words trembled heavy with the shame of her hesitation, like dice. Mike's accusation wasn't just a rebuke. It was a call, a challenge to the crowd's conscience. The tavern, once a place of indifference, now pulsed with the stirrings of accountability. A woman at a corner table, her eyes red-rimmed, gripped her companion's hand, her breath uneven as she grappled with her silence. A younger man, his face pale, stared at the floor, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists, wrestling with the cowardice he hadn't confronted. Clara watched her gaze steady, but tinged with a quiet sorrow, a reflection of the pain not from the biker's fist, but from the room's betrayal. Her eyes, though resolute, carried a trace of grief, a silent acknowledgement of the isolation she'd endured. Yet her strength remained a beacon that held the crowd in its light, forcing them to see what they'd ignored. The room felt raw, stripped bare by Mike's words. The crowd's earlier passivity, once a shield, now lay shattered, replaced by a growing resolve. A grizzled patron at the bar, his voice rough, muttered, "We let her down." His words, though soft, carried a ripple of agreement, a shared admission that spread through the tavern. Jenny's whisper, the man's tears, and the crowd's murmurs wove together a tapestry of regret that marked a turning point. Mike stood firm, his presence a steady guide, his soldiers a silent reminder of the stakes. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His truth was enough, a clarion call that demanded more than shame. It demanded change. The tavern was no longer just a bar. It was a crucible of conscience where the crowd faced the cost of their silence. Clara's fall, the blood on her face, was no longer just her pain, but a shared wound, a lesson etched in the room's collective memory. Mike's words had peeled back their excuses, exposing the simple truth. Courage was the price of respect, and they'd failed to pay it. The man's sobs, Jenny's confession, and Clara's sorrowful gaze were threads in a larger reckoning, one that would linger beyond this night. The crowd, once bystanders, now stood at a crossroads, their shame a spark that could ignite change. Clara's quiet strength, amplified by Mike's challenge, had set the stage for a deeper truth, one she would soon voice, carrying the weight of her experience to reshape the tavern's soul. The weight of Colonel Mike Thompson's words still reverberated in Jack's Tavern, the crowd's newfound remorse, a palpable undercurrent in the dimly lit room. The soldiers stood as a quiet sentinel behind him. their presence a steady reminder of the justice that had unfolded. Clara Thompson, a figure of unyielding resolve, remained the focal point, her bruised cheek no longer just a mark of violence, but a symbol of endurance that had awakened the room's conscience. The man's tears, the waitress's whispered regret, and the murmurs of shame had woven a fragile thread of accountability. But the moment called for more. A voice to bind the tavern's fractured spirit. Clara stirred her movements slow but deliberate, as if drawing strength from the decades she'd carried. She stepped forward, her slight frame commanding the space, and the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on her, sensing the gravity of what was to come. When she spoke, her voice trembled at first, not from fear, but from the depth of feeling she'd held back. "I came here every week." She began her words, steadying, each one imbued with a quiet power that filled the room. Not for the coffee, but because this place was once a home. After Kaisan, I threw parties here for the brothers who made it back, men and women who stared death down and lived. Her voice caught, a fleeting crack that revealed the weight of those memories. But she pressed on her gaze, sweeping the crowd. "I fought for 30 years, gave everything I had, so you could all stand here free. But freedom is hollow if it comes without respect." The words were a clarion call, not laced with anger, but with a piercing truth that struck at the heart of their inaction. The crowd leaned in their breaths shallow, as if her words were pulling them into the battles she'd endured. The tavern seemed to shrink, its rough walls no longer just a backdrop, but a witness to Clara's life laid bare. A woman in a faded sweater, her hands clasped tightly, felt a lump rise in her throat, her eyes glistening as she imagined those long-ago gatherings. A younger man, his face shadowed by guilt, gripped the edge of his table. His knuckles pale as Clara's words stirred a shame he couldn't shake. Her voice grew stronger, a beacon in the room's quiet. "I didn't ask for your pity when I fell," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I didn't need your hands to lift me. What I needed was your voices, your courage to say that what happened here was wrong." The accusation was gentle but unrelenting, a mirror held up to the crowd's silence, forcing them to see the cost of their hesitation. A man near the bar, his weathered face creased with emotion, couldn't hold back. "We're sorry, Mrs. Clara," he shouted, his voice raw, breaking the stillness like a stone through glass. His cry was a spark, igniting a ripple of murmurs, nods and quiet affirmations from the crowd. A woman nearby, her voice choked, added, "We failed you." The apologies, raw and unpolished, carried a sincerity that filled the room, a collective confession that marked a turning point. Clara's eyes softened not with forgiveness, but with understanding, a recognition of their regret. She stood taller, her presence a bridge between the pain of the past and the hope of redemption. "This isn't just about me," she continued, her voice now a steady flame. "It's about who we are, what we stand for. If we let disrespect fester, we lose the very thing I fought for." The tavern was transformed, its air alive with the resonance of Clara's words. The crowd, once bystanders, now felt the stirrings of a deeper resolve, their faces reflecting a mix of sorrow and determination. The man who'd shouted wiped his eyes, his shoulders squared as if ready to carry the lesson forward. The woman in the sweater nodded slowly, her grip loosening as Clara's call took root. Even the younger man, his guilt still raw, lifted his gaze. A flicker of purpose in his eyes. Mike watched his expression, unreadable but proud, his soldiers a quiet testament to the strength Clara embodied. Her speech was more than a rebuke. It was a rallying cry, a demand for a community to reclaim its values. The tavern, once a place of betrayal, now stood on the cusp of renewal, poised for Clara's words to spark a lasting change. A week had passed since the night Jack's Tavern became a crucible of truth, its walls still echoing with the resonance of Clara Thompson's words and the crowd's raw apologies. The air inside had shifted, no longer heavy with the stale scent of beer and regret, but infused with a quiet reverence, a testament to a community stirred to action. The tavern's rough exterior remained unchanged, its neon sign flickering along Highway 9, but within a transformation had taken root, swift and profound, as if the events of that night had ignited a spark that refused to fade. The once cluttered counter, littered with coasters and spilled drinks, now gleamed under soft lighting, its surface cleared to make way for a new focal point. At the heart of the room stood a polished glass case, its contents a solemn tribute that drew every eye, a framed photograph of Clara in her Marine Corps uniform, her gaze fierce yet kind, flanked by a folded American flag and a brass plaque that gleamed with purpose. The plaque's inscription read, "In honor of Clara Thompson, hero of Khe Sanh, beacon of dignity." Each word was etched with care, a declaration that captured the essence of a woman whose courage had reshaped the tavern's soul. The case wasn't just decor, it was a shrine, a daily reminder of the values Clara had defended and the lesson she'd imparted. The transformation had been swift, completed in just 7 days, a reflection of the urgency that had gripped the community. Local veterans, moved by the story that had spread like wildfire, had rallied to fund the display. Their contributions, a quiet act of amends. The tavern's manager, chastened by his earlier failure, had overseen the changes himself, ensuring every detail honored Clara's legacy. The crowd that once shrank from action now gathered with purpose, their faces no longer shadowed by guilt, but lifted by a shared commitment to do better. The tavern had become more than a bar. It was a sanctuary, a place where stories of valor found a home. Every evening, Sea veterans filled the booths, their voices weaving tales of service that hung in the air like sacred relics. A retired sergeant, his hands gnarled but steady, recounted missions in distant lands, his words drawing nods from listeners. A younger woman, her dog tags tucked beneath her shirt, shared memories of desert deployments, her voice soft but unwavering. The younger patrons, once content with their drinks and distractions, now leaned in their eyes wide with awe. A teenage boy, his hoodie pulled low, sat riveted as a Vietnam-era medic described saving lives under fire, his story echoing Clara's own heroism. A college student, her notebook open, scribbled notes, her questions earnest as she sought to understand the sacrifices that had shaped her freedom. The tavern pulsed with connection, its tables no longer barriers but bridges between generations. The change was tangible, woven into the very fabric of the space. The jukebox, once blaring rock anthems, now played softer tunes, patriotic ballads mingling with classic folk, setting a tone of reflection. The walls, once bare, save for faded posters, now bore framed photographs of local veterans, their faces a gallery of pride. A bulletin board near the door overflowed with flyers for community events, veteran meetups, history talks, even a scholarship fund in Clara's name. The manager, his demeanor humbler, now moved through the crowd, offering free coffee to those sharing stories. A small gesture of atonement. Patrons who'd witnessed that fateful night returned their conversations quieter, their glances toward the glass case filled with respect. A woman who'd apologized that night now brought her children, pointing to Clara's photo as she spoke of courage. A man who'd wept now sat proudly among the storytellers, his voice joining theirs. Clara's influence was the heartbeat of this new tavern, her call for respect, a guiding light. The community had answered not with grand gestures, but with steady, earnest change, transforming a place of indifference into a hub of unity. The veterans' stories, the youth's eager listening, and the tavern's renewed purpose were proof that a single act of courage could ripple outward, mending what was broken. The glass case stood as a vow, a promise that Clara's dignity and the dignity of all who served would never again be overlooked. Jack's Tavern had become a living monument, its doors open to those seeking connection, its spirit a reflection of the woman who'd stood unbroken. The changes within its walls were just the beginning, a foundation for a broader awakening that Clara's presence would continue to inspire. The transformation of Jack's Tavern had ignited a spark that refused to be contained, its glow spreading beyond the tavern's walls to envelop the small town along Highway 9. Clara Thompson's stand, her words. A beacon of dignity had become a story whispered in diners, shared in barber shops, and recounted at kitchen tables. The tale of her resilience amplified by her son's resolve, and the tavern's rebirth stirred something deep in the community, a yearning to reclaim the values they'd let slip. In the days following, the town buzzed with a quiet energy, as if Clara's courage had awakened a collective conscience. Veterans long accustomed to keeping their stories close stepped forward, their voices carrying the weight of experience. They organized workshops at the community center, gatherings where courage and dignity were not just words, but calls to action. Drawing crowds eager to listen and learn, these workshops became a lifeline, a place where the town's heart beat strongest. A retired captain, his voice gravelly but firm, spoke of leading men through chaos, his tales of sacrifice echoing Clara's own. A nurse who'd served in Iraq, her hands steady as she described saving lives under fire, captivated a room of wide-eyed listeners. The sessions weren't just lectures. They were conversations with townsfolk, asking questions, sharing fears, and vowing to stand taller. A mechanic, his overalls stained with grease, admitted he'd stayed silent too long, inspired by Clara to speak up at work. A mother of 3, her voice soft but resolute, pledged to teach her children the meaning of respect. The workshops, held in a modest hall lined with folding chairs, became a crucible for change, each story a thread in a tapestry. Clara had begun to weave. Clara herself became a guiding light, her presence sought far beyond the tavern's glow. The local high school, a squat brick building on the town's edge, invited her to speak at an assembly, a rare honor for a woman who'd never sought the spotlight. As she entered the gymnasium, a sea of students rose to their feet, their applause, a thunderous wave that filled the rafters. Grandma Hero. A boy shouted, his voice bright with awe, and the nickname caught like wildfire, chanted by dozens of voices. Clara, her step steady, despite the ache in her joints, reached the podium, her worn cardigan a stark contrast to the vibrant energy around her. The students quieted their faces, expectant, sensing the weight of her words before she even spoke. She looked out at them, her eyes warm but piercing, and began, "Don't let silence kill anyone's dignity." She said, her voice clear, each word a stone dropped into still water. Not your friends, not strangers, not yourselves. Speak up when it's hard, because that's when it matters most. The simplicity of her message, delivered with the conviction of someone who'd lived it, struck a chord. A girl in the front row, her braid swinging as she nodded, felt a spark of courage ignite. A boy near the back, his arms crossed, let them fall, his guarded expression softening as Clara's words sank in. Teachers standing along the walls exchanged glances, their own resolve strengthened by her call. The gym, filled with the hum of adolescent energy, became a sanctuary of purpose. Clara's voice, a bridge between her generation's sacrifices and the next's potential. The impact of her words rippled outward, touching lives beyond the school's walls. Students launched a campaign to honor local veterans, collecting stories for a town archive. A group of teens, inspired by Clara's speech, organized a cleanup of the Veterans Memorial Park, their laughter mingling with pride as they worked. The town's newspaper ran a front-page feature on Clara, dubbing her Grandma Hero. a title that spread to neighboring counties. Veterans from nearby towns began attending the workshops, their numbers swelling the community center's modest space. A local artist moved by Clara's story painted a mural on the tavern's exterior depicting a Marine in silhouette. Her face unmistakably, Clara's standing tall against a rising sun. The mural became a landmark, a symbol of the town's renewed spirit. Clara, though humbled by the attention, embraced her role not as a hero, but as a teacher. She attended workshops, listened to others' stories, and offered quiet encouragement, her presence a steady guide. The town, once content to drift, had found a purpose, its people bound by a shared commitment to dignity and courage. The workshops, the students' applause, and the mural were more than gestures. They were proof that one voice could spark a movement. Clara's influence had woven a new fabric for the community, one that honored the past while building a braver future. Her words, simple yet profound, had set the stage for a final moment of recognition, where the town would show its gratitude in a way that would resonate for years to come. The sun dipped low over the hills, casting a golden glow across the quiet town along Highway 9, where Jack's Tavern stood as a beacon of renewal. Inside, the hum of conversation mingled with the soft strains of a folk ballad, the air warm with the camaraderie of a community reborn. Clara Thompson, her presence a quiet anchor, sat at a corner table, her worn cardigan draped loosely over her shoulders. Colonel Michael Thompson, his military bearing softened by a rare smile, sat beside her. Their shared silence a testament to a bond forged through trials. The tavern was alive, its tables filled with townsfolk who'd come not just for a drink, but for connection drawn by the stories and spirit that now defined the place. The glass case honoring Clara gleamed under the lights, its plaque a daily reminder of the dignity she'd defended. As the evening deepened, Clara and Mike rose to leave their steps unhurried, a moment that felt like any other until it wasn't. As they moved toward the door, a ripple passed through the crowd. A young woman at a nearby table stood, her hand resting over her heart, her eyes fixed on Clara with unspoken gratitude. The gesture spread swift and unprompted as others rose, veterans with weathered faces, students with eager gazes, and families who'd heard the story that had changed their town. One by one they placed their hands over their chests, a silent salute that filled the room with reverence. The music faded, the jukebox falling quiet, and the tavern held its breath, the moment sacred in its simplicity. A teenage boy, his voice breaking the stillness, stepped forward, his eyes bright with conviction. "Thank you, Mrs. Clara," he shouted, his words raw. Heartfelt, a cry that carried the weight of a community's awakening. The call ignited the room, a chorus of voices joining in, soft at first, then swelling with emotion. "Thank you." They echoed a wave of gratitude that washed over the tavern like a tide. Clara paused, her hand on the door, her breath catching as she turned to face the crowd. Her eyes, sharp yet gentle, glistened with unshed tears, a rare glimpse of the heart beneath her stoic exterior. She looked at Mike, her son, whose own gaze softened with pride, and a small, radiant smile curved her lips. "I fought my whole life for this," she said, her voice low but clear, each word trembling with the weight of decades. "To see a day when people stand together not just for me but for what's right." The words were simple, yet they carried a profound truth, a final testament to her journey. The crowd fell silent, their hands still over their hearts, as if her words had sealed a pact, a vow to carry her lesson forward. Mike's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of love and respect, anchoring her in the moment. The tavern seemed to glow, its walls no longer just wood and plaster, but a canvas of shared humanity. The young woman who'd first stood wiped her eyes, her resolve strengthened by Clara's words. A veteran near the bar, his dog tags glinting, nodded slowly as if recommitting to the values he'd served. The boy who'd shouted his cheeks flushed, stood taller, his shout a spark that had lit a fire. Every face in the room bore the mark of change. Mothers who'd teach their children courage, workers who'd speak against wrong students who'd carry Clara's story into the future. The town had etched her lesson into its soul. Dignity must never be traded for silence. It was a truth born from Clara's pain, forged in her defiance, and cemented by her grace, a legacy that would endure beyond this night. As Clara and Mike stepped into the cool evening, the crowd's voices followed a soft murmur of thanks that lingered in the air. The tavern door closed behind them, but the light within spilled out. A symbol of a community transformed. Clara's smile, fleeting but genuine, was her final gift, a sign that her fight had found its purpose. Mike walked beside her, his heart full, knowing her strength had reshaped not just a tavern, but a town. The stars above gleamed, each one a witness to a moment where justice had prevailed, where courage had triumphed, and where a single woman's voice had reminded a community of who they could be. The town would carry Clara's truth forward, a promise that no act of disrespect would go unchallenged, a legacy of dignity that would echo for generations. Under the starlit sky of a quiet town along Highway 9, Jack's Tavern glows as a symbol of transformation, its walls forever marked by Clara Thompson's unyielding courage. What began as a night of violence, a brutal punch that sent an 85-year-old Marine Corps veteran to the floor, became a catalyst for change, a testament to the power of one woman's resolve, Clara's defiance. Her son Mike's unwavering stand, and a community's awakening turned a moment of betrayal into a movement of dignity. From the tavern's glass case, honoring Clara's heroism, to the workshops where veterans share stories of valor, her legacy has woven a new thread into the town's fabric. The mural of her silhouette, the chants of Grandma Hero from students, and the quiet resolve of townsfolk who now speak against wrong, all are ripples of her impact. Proof that courage can mend what silence breaks. Clara's story is more than a tale of triumph. It's a mirror held up to our own choices. When faced with injustice, will we stand silent, or will we find the strength to act her words? Don't let silence kill anyone's dignity. Challenge us to look beyond ourselves, to see the worth in every person, and to speak when it matters most. This town, once adrift, found its way because Clara refused to bow, because Mike answered her call, and because a community chose to listen. Their journey reminds us that dignity isn't just a right, it's a responsibility, one we carry in every word, every action, every moment we choose to stand tall. But this story isn't complete without you. What moment in Clara's journey struck you deepest? Was it her defiance in the face of violence, Mike's swift justice, or the town's heartfelt renewal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this tale touched you. Clara's courage is a spark, and your voice can help it burn brighter. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that ignite the spirit and challenge the heart. Let's keep these stories alive, spreading their lessons far and wide. Clara Thompson's legacy is a call to action, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a single act of bravery can light the way. The town along Highway 9 will never forget the night a veteran's strength reshaped their soul, nor the woman who showed them what it means to stand for what's right. Her fight wasn't just for herself, it was for all of us, for the values that bind us, for the dignity that defines us. As we leave Jack's Tavern behind, let's carry Clara's truth with us, letting it guide our steps in a world that needs courage, now more than ever. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Let's honor Clara by speaking up, standing together, and building a future where no one's dignity is left undefended.